Okay, I'm going to start introducing. Professor Shaina Kelly and her research team investigate and optimize the interplay between transport phenomena and fluid-rock interactions in geologic and engineered porous media for sustainable energy applications. Dr. Shaina joined the Department of Earth and Environmental Engineering at Columbia University as an assistant professor in July of last year. Prior to her appointment, Dr. Shaina's over 6 years of industry experience include roles as senior petrophysicist at ConocoPhillips Company and senior geoscience engineer at Aqua NRG Consulting, where she worked on related transport in porous media research topics. Dr. Shaina received her PhD in petroleum and geosystems engineering from right here in 2015, and her bachelor's degree in environmental engineering from University of Florida in 2011. And whenever you're ready, please start sharing your screen.
Okay, thank you, Nur. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Okay. And can you see the presentation?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Okay, well, let's kick this off. Thank you everyone for attending. I see some familiar faces in the audience, which makes me really happy. Today I'm going to be talking about predictive multi-phase flow assessments of the impact of fluid-mineral interactions on subsurface processes, in particular carbon storage and mineralization, and we'll touch a little bit about broader implications such as hydrogen storage as well. The overarching goal here is to really understand how some of the pore-scale processes are upscaled to some of the larger goals that we have with the energy challenges facing us today. So a lot of times when I start my presentations on these sorts of technical matters, I like to state the aim. And it's a broad aim, but it's one that my research team works on in different ways. And it's how do different alteration processes, these can be dissolution, precipitation with complex minerals, it could be hydration processes, how do they change the petrophysical properties of those materials? And those would, some common ones would be porosity permeability, relative perm, capillary pressure, so on and so forth. So all of these begin at the pore scale, and that's where we're going to center a lot of our talk today. Okay, just as an agenda to see what we'll cover in this talk, I'll do a little bit of background about my team and just the challenges and mechanisms that we're facing with energy transition activities such as carbon storage and mineralization. Then we'll talk about linking pore-scale properties to models. That's pretty germane to everyone in, geological sciences. A lot of people look at thin sections and such, which are often static data, and really linking those, but they're very informative static data. So linking those to larger scale processes, dynamic processes, is of utmost importance. What's become very interesting to me in recent years is that I've been used to looking at sedimentary rocks, but here at Columbia, there's a lot of presence looking at what I call very, very unconventional rocks, which are some of the mafic, ultramafic rocks, these hard rock formations. So that's been really fun for me to compare those pore structures and as to those I've traditionally studied. Okay, then going forward, we'll talk about both computational frameworks and some experimental validations that let us kind of look at that interaction between the mineral fluid interactions and multi-phase flow. Some people call it reactive transport. There's different terms for this. Then finally, we'll talk a little bit about how those sort of results link to actual petrophysical measurements and reservoir modeling. So here's just some preview images that we'll see later. Again, when talking about precipitant, you'll see lots of images with various species growing on surfaces. Okay, as to a bit of background, I, as Nur introduced, am a new professor at Columbia in the Department of Earth and Environmental Engineering. I just wanted to introduce our department really quickly because it has an interesting history that's actually rooted in the subsurface. So we, until 2000, were actually the School of Mines at Columbia, and were or are technically the oldest department within the Department of Engineering. So it's kind of interesting that now some of those history are coming back with like all the critical minerals work and other subsurface type processes. So here's just some pictures of Columbia, and as well as a historic picture. Let me turn on my pointer. Great. My lab, Kelly Lab, as pretty much this states what Nura introduced, but broadly speaking, we like to look at that feedback loop between changes you have with your porous media and how that's going to impact the flow. And in truth, it is a feedback loop, because if you have a precipitant growing, the flow routes will be changed, so on and so forth. Here's just some pictures from our lab. We like colloquially to call ourselves pore store, but that's our informal name. Yeah, so here's some of my team I'd like to introduce. A lot of the work that you'll see today is coming from Tian Zhao and Rosie Krasnov. We also have some work featured from my postdoc, Zhu Hao. And all the others that are featured have contributed in some part as well. So we went through my history already, but I'm not going to read every part of it. But I'd like to say that I try to bring a diverse set of perspectives to my research, because I've worked in industry, I've worked for a startup, and now as a professor, I see there's no one solution to some of these reactive transport problems. We have to, look from the pore-scale, but also integrate with the petrophysical measurements. And yeah, that's a theme you'll see throughout this talk as well. Okay, so research drivers, what motivates us? At a very, very high level, we say, how do we optimize containment, deliverability, and storage? Well, those are the questions everyone's asking, right? For carbon storage, hydrogen storage, you want to be able to cycle fluids. The problem is that a lot of these applications fall on different parts of a spectrum of where you, like the amount of storage of your formation versus the deliverability. So I made this little canvas in like Microsoft Word at one point, and it's very cartoonish, but I like it. It's kind of showing a matrix that essentially has an overprint of various subsurface or subsurface facing type technologies, and shows that we need to pull different levers in terms of how much storage capacity of the rock or how permeable it is. And we're kind of all over the map. So we really need to understand how some of these pore-scale processes will help, guarantee containment or deliverability. So to do that, we generally focus on three themes in my lab. One is characterization fabrication, which is a common bedrock, pun intended, a bedrock theme. The next one would be looking at interfacial properties, especially the effect of pore confinement on those. My PhD was about looking at the effect of nano confinement on interfacial interactions. So theme 2 is kind of near and dear to my heart. Theme 3 is putting this all together, how basically multi-physics and multi-phase fluid dynamics are controlled by those. So the one that we're talking about today is really, altering fluids solid interactions, but any of the questions shown in these green boxes, in theory, can be answered with a good, like if you have a good workflow to go through these themes. Okay, so again, here's just another diagram to show some of the energy transition activities that, a lot of us are mutually interested in. And sometimes they're even in the same rock, sometimes they're in very different lithologies. Again, it's kind of understanding where do we want to be with those levers. In some cases, do we need to dial up the volume of clay? Is high V clay really good? In other cases, do we want low matrix perm? These at a high level seem very obvious, but when you're trying to optimize processes and we deal with the heterogeneity of the subsurface, we all know this gets quite complex. So a theme you're going to see throughout the talk is shown here. This is a visual from Tian Zhao, one of my PhD students, and it's just a couple hundred microns across, but it's showing nucleation within three-dimensional pore-scale representation. And those nucleation can be generalized. Like here it's carbonate, but it can be generalized to really anything. We could code in for a biofilm in hydrogen storage. It can be just diagenetic, like a typical clay precipitation. So from a framework perspective, the tools that we're trying to build to look at these can be very versatile, although then you can tune the reactions to particular processes. Great. So this might be a review for everyone here because we have a lot of geologists in the room. But for some people, especially engineers, I like to start out by reviewing the potential we have for CO2 storage and mineralization. So again, mineralization is where we're actually changing the CO2 to rocks through carbonate reactions. And this occurs in silicates, mafic, ultramafic rocks. And here is a map of some of the potential for some of those silicates. The basalts and the peridotite, for example, are shown here, as well as some of the ongoing projects. I think that just this week, there was a convention about the projects in Iceland. Pacific Northwest National Lab has some very exciting projects going as well. So here is a very localized pore-scale image from the Pacific Northwest pilot of CO2 injection and mineralization, which is happening in Washington State. This picture was taken from one of their articles in Environmental Science and Technology. They've recently published quite a few to show about the progress of that site. And I do believe they are the only supercritical CO2 injection project in basalts in the world at this time. So as opposed to some, there's like Hardfix's aqueous CO2. Anyway, so what they're seeing at Wallula, as shown in the articles, is a significant amount of various species of precipitant. And for example, here you can see nodular carbonates. And they've done a lot of petrography work to characterize where that carbonation is nucleating and the species type. Some of the remaining questions there, and probably for future projects, will be, why does it nucleate where it does? How is that a transport control? Can we enhance that? And so that's the kind of questions that we're thinking about this talk. So while I sort of have a current bias a little bit to looking at some of the very reactive rocks like basalts, we can't forget that there are still very reactive surfaces in our traditional storage reservoirs. Well, I wouldn't say very reactive, but reactive type surfaces. So here's just a map of some of the potential basins that could be used for traditional CO2 storage or hydrogen storage and cycling. As you guys at BEG are very well aware, as you're mapping a lot of these out, for hydrogen storage, there's a lot of interest to be underneath rock salt. And in this case, the reactivity is a bit different than that we've seen in the basalt rocks, but you might have, as you know, biogeochemical reactivity, where essentially there could be biofilms growing. And just as you saw in that previous model, biofilms can still be a pore occluding process that you'd want to model and see how it influences the porosity and permeability of your local facies. Great. So I'm going to take a sip of water. One sec. So back to CO2, let's look at sort of the differences in pore structures with some of these mafic, ultramafic rocks I was talking about. Here is sort of a busy slide, but this table goes through the typical rock types for typical geologic carbon storage, or in situ carbon mineralization, as it's sometimes called. So here we see, as everyone's probably seen many times, like a lovely sandstone thin section image. On the other side, we have a thin section of vesicular basalt. Now the pores are huge. These were actually all images taken in my lab, and I'll tell you, we can hold this thin section up and almost see everything with the naked eye. The problem is that the connectivity is not so great. Always, it depends on the rock. But where there might be great technical storage capacity, some of the permeability, especially relative permeability in these rocks with a very high pore to very small aspect ratio when it comes to connections can be very tricky. I'd like to also point your attention to this dunite, which are missing an N there, but which is a very ultramafic rock, so highly reactive, but often very tight. This particular one, I think it had 1 to 2% porosity, which is like a very, very tight in my book. And when I'm used to dealing with shales, which I thought were tight. Essentially, when we look into these, we had to look into the literature to see that, yeah, a lot of the pore structure is in phyllosilicates that are stuck between major grains. So it's almost analogous in my mind to, you know, the bitumen porosity that we'd see between grains and shales. Here you have a lot of phyllosilicate clay porosity between larger scale grains. So anyway, one thing, the big thing then is, what is the accessible reactive surface area in these rocks? And my student Tianjia likes to call it just A sub R. Yeah, that's a big question here now that you can kind of, you know, appreciate the differences at the pore scale. So yeah, that leads us to some of the challenges here. Why do we care about accessible reactive surface area? Well, when it comes to carbon mineralization, as we know, a very stable form of storing carbon, we pretty much have a very complex reactive transport problem where we care about the accessibility of surfaces to dissolve divalent cations. We then want to see how they transport. Do they just precipitate right back at the same voxel or location where they came from? Or are they, you know, they're precipitating at elsewhere? And why do they nucleate at certain sites? Also, this is usually driven by a pH swing of sorts. So understanding, you know, how diffuse or how quickly buffered things are to precipitate that. So mineralization, basically how to enhance it locally starts at the pore scale. But at the same time, as it's happening, as shown in this little cartoon version of our thin section, as we're filling in that pore space, how much are we not only, of course, occluding the porosity and permeability, but how are we affecting the various trapping mechanisms? You know, this is a rather complex problem. Just for perspective, I think you guys are heavily geologically, it's a heavy geologic audience here, so I probably don't need to explain this, but sometimes me being an engineer, it's really helpful to contextualize where rocks fall on the Bowden sequence to see how felsic to mafic they are, and essentially remembering that as we go towards the ultramafic, we're going to have a very high amount of these reactive surface areas, and some of them in the lab react on the order of hours when put in carbonated cells. Okay, so again, why do we care about these challenges? Well, I think everyone has probably seen these plots. They were first, I think Sally Benson had the first one. It's been recreated in many papers. This one particularly came from Professor Kellerman, a colleague of mine at Columbia. But anyway, we see that we know there's various trapping mechanisms, and these apply for whatever your gas is. But the last one, the mineral trapping, is going to have interplay with all these others. So that's what I was describing, but why do we care? Well, it's going to really dictate the X and Y axis of this plot, particularly the X axis, which is time scale. And a lot of these plots, we just don't know, you know, if the rates we input, they can give a difference from 10 years to sometimes 1,000 years in mineralization. Anyway, so the big challenge number 2 is basically that while we can appreciate the importance of geochemistry in the mafic rocks, it's often hard to upscale some of the data we have to match transport and porous media paradigms or frameworks. So often what the case is that we have a wonderful set of data done by our geochemist or chemical engineer that's done on crushed material and gives us the kinetics or the K value. They give dissolution rates as well as carbonation rates. However, there's often a big chasm because the rocks, as we looked at, sometimes look like this, looks like a countertop to me, sometimes with, you know, heterogeneity, so on and so forth. So some of the questions then would be, well, going from a crush to a bulk rock, what sort of massive changes might we have in accessible reactor surface area? That's going to create a different K value, or an effective sort of kinetics, if you will. Also, when you have multi-phase flow, which you probably will if you're injecting, a different phase, which in the case of CO2, you're into, like, let's say a brine-filled reservoir, you will have two phases. So you need to understand the growth dynamics in aqueous films and, capillary trap regions. Also, as we talked about, the degradation of porosity perm. Okay, so how do we approach that? Essentially, we my team, as well as many others, there's a lot of great people working in this space, are looking at the overprint of transport on some of these geochemical rates, and you can call that effective, if you will. And here's just an image from a slice from one of Tianzhao's simulations, but it's essentially seeing how when you have two phases and a precipitant, in this case the precipitant is yellow in most of the simulations, I think it is, so hopefully that's consistent throughout the presentation, and how that changes with time. So one thing I want to note again is that dissolution and carbonation rates are tricky. Here is a plot from my colleague, Professor Kellerman's paper, and you can see here that even like at the batch reactor scale, there's large bands. These aren't dots on this plot. So these are like the reactive rates of some very particularly reactive minerals at two temperatures, room temperature and elevated temperature. And yes, we all know temperature is a great driver of reactions. But even there's a band, orders of magnitude. And then when you put the overprint of transport, like just how accessible those surfaces are, these bands can grow even quite larger. Anyway, so hopefully I've set the stage pretty well for kind of how we're thinking about the problem and why it's so important for your petrographic work and understanding what minerals are touching the pore surfaces or what's blocking them, and giving a framework to upscale that information. Yeah. Oh, I forgot I had this slide in here, but this was just an images that, again, appreciating petrography at the pore scale. You might have a mineral, but something might be coating it or blocking it, as we've seen very often with bitumens and shales. And then other times, the mineral just might not be accessible, such as these nanoporous clays that are often seen in some of the mafic rocks. This is chrysotil. Okay, great. So how do we translate that? It sounds like a tall order. Well, those pore scale simulations that I was talking about and showed a quick video earlier, and we'll go through more pretty videos a little later. Essentially, we can quantify them. If we've done a good job representing the pore domain, or can justify that it seems representative of some aspect of the system that is scalable, then we can just get very representative quantitative values like porosity-permeability trends. We can get trends of accessible reactor surface area, and we can get various time-lapse relative perm and saturation values. So the inputs here, more on the traditional geologic side and the traditional routine core analysis side, would feed into these models. These models then give said relationships, and said relationships then feed into reservoir engineering models, as well as large-scale reactor transport models. As many of you know, relative perm is sort of one of the bread and butter variables of a reservoir scale model, but is also a big knob. It's as it's hard to tack down, and might be even harder for some of these complex interactions. For things such as reactive transport models, large scale ones, there's you've heard of TUF and STOMP. Essentially, a lot of them will rely on a certain porosity permeability relationship, as well as assuming certain accessible reactive surface area in the geochemical libraries. So anyway, this was more just like kind of setting a roadmap for how some of these variables translate from small scale to large scale. Okay, so We're going to get to simulation soon, I promise, but I just wanted to again set the stage of some of the challenges we've been noticing in our work. So my team has been looking at some mafic rocks, some basalts from the Newberry volcano in Oregon. These were collected at USGS. And all of these from the mineral perspective are amazing. We're like, oh, super, super high amount of reactivity. However, when we go through a traditional characterization workflow, which is being led by my postdoc, Sue Howe, we see that the connectivity is very difficult because a lot of these rocks have already been altered. Now, is that good or bad? There's some studies that say if a rock is altered, some of those alteration sites can be really great for nucleation of carbonate minerals. So that could be good. But at the same time, we have the issue that are we even able to stuff fluids in there? And that's a theme that you've heard me repeat again and again, but it is an important theme where not all rocks seem to be flowing as well as those that we've seen, for example, in the Iceland pilot. So we do have to do our due diligence to have a lot of characterization work done by great scientists such as yourself to look into these connectivity of these rocks. Here's just an example of one of the better samples in our lab. It looks super connected. We're just, it's, you guys have seen a lot of these images, but basically black is usually pore space. However, when we end up running both flow tests, a partner ran a perm experiment for us, and we did numerical flow tests. We find that these actually are very poorly connected as a whole. So you have to be careful of how far you zoom into some of these rocks. They also have some of them have a very tight matrix. So here's an NMR for one of these vesicular basalts. And essentially, it's a very odd spectrum. By the way, this was done in collaboration with my partners at Green Imaging Technologies. Anyway, so it has a very odd pore structure, probably because we're used to looking at the nice bimodal peaks of a sandstone or shale. However, we often know with various technologies that some of the matrix is so tight that we weren't able to fill it with fluid to be able to detect it with NMR. Great. Okay. So, okay, this is a lot of words that are a little, maybe I've already stated them, but I just wanted to point out that something that the group is working on that we'll all be challenged with is with these workflows, how to relate them to the time scale. Again, we can put in any K value or, A to B reaction as a function of, whatever our geochemist gives us. However, really being able to translate it out to what part in the plume or in the injection cycle that discrete little simulation is representing is a challenge that needs multiple team members. So currently we just assume that we are running a Lattice-Boltzmann simulation, for example, and it's representing different states in time. But yeah, obviously it's very cost prohibitive and impossible to run a fully dynamic over the complete complete reactive transport of the flow field. Okay, so I'm going to show what my student Tian Zhao is currently working on. He basically uses various Lattice-Boltzmann method codes. This one is from actually James McClure's open source code. I have another student that built one in-house based on Julia that's working pretty well as well. We're pretty agnostic to the source as long as we can be very flexible and use it to advance some of these questions. So what Tianjia does is runs a loop, and based on the velocity fields, puts rules, and he can change the rules, but a rule basically for where precipitation might occur. Now, those rules should be informed by interfacial studies, but like I said, in a framework perspective, he can change that to probe sensitivity of nucleation. Anyway, so it's a bit of a feedback loop. And then the team can also change, of course, just like any pore-scale model, the initial conditions of the simulation and the boundary conditions. So that might be how much water like residual waters and the saturation is in the rock, or what is the delta P across the sample, things like that. Some other members in the team are doing experiments to better understand the nucleation as a function of flow rate. So those are the kind of relationships or rules we can put into these models. Again, these yield things that we can hand over to our reservoir engineers, and if done well, they might believe us and use them, or at least compare them to perhaps the curves they were already using. The key part is just, again, really understand where these models are in the plume. We run a lot of these models. I'm just showing examples, but the challenge is in these arrows, really. I mean, it's a technical challenge to create the models well, but then really putting it in context remains to be seen in a robust way. So those are long-term goals. Of course, in terms of making sure these models are representative, that's where you really have to work well with your geologist to make sure you're representing the flow unit properties. Okay, great. So let's look at an example, just one scenario today for one of these models. So we're going to look at the yellow case, which we took a Bentheimer geometry as well as an engineered rock, which is just sintered bead pack. And we're going to look at a super saturated solution going through this rock and see about the precipitation. Essentially, you could see this as like a pseudo-diagenic process. We are working on the vesicular basalt, but as alluded to, it's tricky because of the pore structure. So already it was very easy for us to run, not easy, but it was more facile for us to run in a typical geometry. But already the basalt geometry, due to these huge changes from large pore to very small pore connections, is giving us a run for our money. So challenges are fun. Anyway, so essentially we're using here, or as a framework, the Q over K value, and saying essentially in a lot of these in a lot of these models that are done at the geochemistry level, again, we assume an accessible reactive surface area, but our pore-scale models are sort of yielding how that accessible surface area is a function of time, capillary number, Peckley number, all those conditions that you can vary in this like digital rock space. Okay, so let's just zoom into that real quick. Here's just where we looked at about that size of a Bentheimer. Again, we know that Bentheimers won't be particularly reactive, but it's a great REV that has been well validated and studied. So we're going to pretend we can, we're putting a super carbonated brine and super saturated through there. Essentially, then again, there's the nucleation. We showed this before, but you can see it growing. Tianzhao set the nodular growth here, and he put a Q over K value of, I think, like 10. So it's super exaggerated because it's a visual. Here's the 2D slice of this. Okay, you can see the growth with time. This one's a bit dynamic, but you can do it you can do this in steady state as well. Anyway, so here's an example for that domain of the change in porosity and permeability. Again, I'm not saying this is particularly meaningful at present for a certain formation, but this is showing the framework, which we can then apply for, a specific formation for it as given. Again, the challenge is going to be the time scale, but from a porosity, like when we change along this porosity perm. But in terms of the morphology, we're able to see the changes of how, as porosity change, how the perm changes as a function of the nucleation behavior. At the same time, then Tianzhao will extract dynamic, or he calls them reactive relative perm curves. He runs for each state of saturation. He'll run then a fully steady state perm curve. So he kind of like takes snapshots in time and then puts them through a steady state. Still finessing, the right way to really go about this, but it's in exploration mode, and we have been enjoying seeing how sensitive, these curves can get as a function of, our nucleation mechanisms. Okay, so let's look at, I've been showing the nodules the whole time. Let's look at a different nucleation mechanism. So here we have that same Bentheimer type geometry, and we're looking at two end members of nucleation. One is the seeding growth or nodules, and the other is a film growth. In this case, we actually have a supersaturated brine going into a supercritical CO2. And in this case, we did add wettability effects. The other one was pretty neutral. This time it has a very water-wet wettability for the silicate. And then the precipitant has a slightly less water-wet. And you can, that's another element of interest here, that and as you precipitate things, the surface chemistry is different, so you are potentially altering wettability as well. So for these, then you can do things like extract the change in pore size distribution with that interplay with mineralization, wettability, the interplay between pore size distribution, mineralization, and wettability. For the seeding growth, it pretty much, as you might expect, you just see a bump kind of at some specific areas, which is where those nodulars kind of filled the pore space. For the film growth, more or less, the pore size distribution shifts. I know this is sort of an unconventional way to look at pore size distribution. Tianzhao likes to plot it this way, but we can always just flip the axes as needed. So again, maybe you say, oh, why does this matter? Well, if you're closing off certain throats, that is going to matter, especially if that's in the vicinity of your wellbore. So my question is, what will this look like in a vesicular basalt? Still in progress, but so far, a lot of closure. More to come on that. So let's look at the seeding case. So here is the rel perm curve drainage case. You can see this is actually saturation, the non-wetting phase on the x-axis. And essentially we're looking at the relative perm curve and how it's changing with precipitation. And I just realized I assumed most of you have seen relative perm, but for those who haven't, again, this is just showing the permeability of each phase, like the water and CO2. It could be water and hydrogen if you're modeling that system. It's showing it with changes in saturation. So the interesting part here is that you might say, well, why don't you have two plots? You've been showing this model of precipitation to two different end members. Well, it's been very difficult actually sometimes to model the film flow because the film growth obstructs your pore space so much that sometimes you also get very quick declines in your permeability. So again, why does this matter? Well, next you take those perm curves like we just shown, you give them to your reservoir engineer. And this was work done by a master's student. It's a nice, cute little project, but just looking at how sensitive essentially some of the trapping mechanisms are, like structural, residual trapping, dissolved as a function of your rel perm curves. So again, if those curves are changing somewhere in the plume as a function of alteration, we probably want to know that. And this is probably an exercise most reservoir engineers have had to do as part of their training to just see the sensitivity of some of those curves. And we really need to know this for carbon storage because there have literally been cases where the plume in some of the early pilots goes the opposite direction of where they thought. And it's really important to understand that progression, of course. Okay, so going forward, we work a lot also with sintered beads, and we do some where we actually sinter in reactive inclusion, which I'll show in a few minutes. But anyway, beads are great, as everyone knows, because you can control things. But in this particular bead pack, we're just showing how you can use these methods to also look at some of these injection schemes that are being looked at for some of these carbon mineralization and storage pilots. And water alternating gas is one that has been talked about quite a bit, I believe, in the context of CarbFix as well. Again, water alternating gas, that means, that's quite a relative permeability scenario. So that's something where Tianzhao here is looking at essentially these different imbibition and drainage cycles. and then seeing how the residuals of the phases change with those cycles. This one, not too dramatic a change because it was super porous, but again, we're seeing very different results with the tight rocks. Another thing you can use these type of models for, and some of this is not new, by the way. We've been doing digital rock physics like this for years, but now we're kind of just putting it in a different context. So in this case, we're using it to look at like the accessible surface area that's touched by the aqueous film versus flow rate. In this case, why do we care about this? Because carbonation happens in the aqueous film. So here there's just different flow rates. One's super fast, the other still super fast, but in lattice space, these, I think Tianzhao told me these were these made sense. But anyway, so maybe this is super fast flow rate near a wellbore. You're going to have different amounts of contacted surface area, and we're able to track those in the numerical space. Okay, and here are just some examples of the different bead packs the experimentalists on my team have been creating. This one is made by Rosie Krasnoff, and essentially you can kind of create very idealized domains where we know what the porosity and perm is by controlling the sintering temperature. Okay, so let's delve a little bit. We're running low on time. I think I have about 8 minutes left before Q&A. So essentially, we'll just do quickly a fly through about some of the experiments that are now complementing these multi-phase fluid flow simulations. So they fall into 3 categories. The first is looking at glass mixtures with reactive minerals such as olivine or magnesium oxide. So you can have a traditional sintered glass, but sometimes we sinter, in this case at 725C, reactive inclusions. Then these can be made in both mini cores and larger cores, and we collaborate with colleagues such as at Columbia's Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory to see how these synthetic cores fare in a triaxial cell reactor that looks at various CO2 flow through conditions. What's nice is versus like real rocks, we've kind of controlled everything so we can hopefully better understand the outputs and what's controlling them, but it's still pretty tricky. We also do and have just been launching off some 3D microfluidics where we have very mini cores of these type of composites, as well as some planar microfluidics. And I, in my previous lifetime, I did a bit of nanofluidics and microfluidics, but this time we're kind of keeping it very simple and focusing on sort of including minerals in here and maybe compromising the geometry, making it a little simpler, but really focusing in on the in situ minerals and how they react. So here's just some examples of that. There's a picture of one of Rosie's synthetic cores. Here's a mini version of it that can be have flow through dynamics. Here's an SEM, or not SEM, sorry, micro CT. I forgot the scale bar there, but we're looking at probably some of these inclusions are kind of large, like 200 microns or 300 microns. Anyway, so then, like I mentioned, sometimes these will go through core floods, and we can look at pre and post reactions. So this work was done with Rosie in collaboration with Jake Tilke at our Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory. And here we can see essentially that the reactive inclusions before and then afterwards for this particular flow through experiment only reacted locally. And you might not be able to tell, what happened here, but essentially these MgO formed Nesquihone carbonate species, but they only reacted locally instead of, flowing into the porous domain. So that's interesting. The question is, are there any cases where they do precipitate downstream? And so those are like ongoing investigations to see that. So anyway, that was just an example. Another type that Rosie and others are working on are these, I call them super simple microfluidics, but very, very informative. So if we isolate certain crystals and control flow rate and injection and monitor fluids, we can maybe better understand why certain precipitants occur. And these are just, again, very early work. So here's an example of an MgO crystal. This is just a potential example of what might happen, that you have the crystal beforehand, and then afterwards you can see, after flowing with the sodium bicarbonate solution, you can see nucleation. Anyway, hopefully this kind of paints a picture of ways to tie, again, the petrography type pore-scale work to flow. And then other times, again, we do see different species. This, I believe, Rosie told me, maybe as a brucite, well, to be determined with some EDAX, EDX. Okay, finally, Tian Zhao is also working on simulations that are microfluidics that then can be calibrated against some of the microfluidics work we're working on. That way we can better calibrate the models. So there's like soft calibration where we say, oh, the precipitation grows in a nodule, and then we're like, okay, that makes sense, that's what we're doing in our models. But then there's maybe hard calibration where we could actually have a one-to-one of the same geometry. So those are ongoing as well. Yeah, so finally, I just want to wrap up. I have just 3 more minutes. So I just wanted to say that some other work is at the larger scale. So how you can use traditional special core analysis techniques, such as nuclear magnetic resonance, to better understand those nucleation precipitation mechanisms. This work was presented at ERTEC and was done in collaboration with Green Imaging Technologies. Essentially, when we look at NMR of a rock such as a basalt that might precipitate carbonates, we are looking for shifts in the pore size distribution. Basically, does it go to the left? That means that essentially the pores are getting smaller, so they're closing up. Does it go up and down, which means that maybe you're getting more access to pores of a certain size? Or does it go to the right, which in this case might mean that things are dissolving? So again, NMR is a great proxy for pore size distribution. Anyway, so we run actual rock samples, again, with our partners at Lamont Doherty. And on those samples, they are able to tell us the change in permeability with flow. For this particular sample, it's a Twin Sisters dunite from Washington State. Then we can look at SEM to kind of get an idea what happened, get the permeability with time, and then we complement it by looking at the NMR. In this case, the sample did have a significant change in permeability. I forgot what, it went from 113 to 11 microdarcies. And to tell you the truth, they artificially added like grain boundary fractures to this sample to give it a little bit more permeability. Anyway, so then we also, before and after carbonation flow through experiments, saw a change in the pore size distribution. So what does this mean? Well, looking at those pore size distribution changes and comparing to the thin section and SEM structures of these types of rocks, we were able to determine that the mechanism that was happening in this particular experiment was indeed likely a seeding growth or nodular growth mechanism, such as shown in Tian Zhao's early simulations. Now, what's interesting is that, as I alluded to early in the talk, this is also one of the more prevalent types of carbonation mechanisms seen at the Wallula pilot done by Pacific Northwest National Lab. So it was kind of nice to see, very softly, but that the NMR, the Wallula petrography, and some of the models were telling, a similar story. Yeah, so that was about it. I'm going to throw some synthesis points up here. The main point is that these sort of forward modeling can really elucidate the influence of any sort of precipitation or even a biofilm growth, if it's hydrogen storage, on the flow properties of various rock types. And I think it's really a pathway for helping us understand enhanced fluid rock interactions. Anyway, I'd like to thank my team and as well as my students and some of our internal and external funding sources. And yeah, thank you. Sorry to go a little over.
Yeah, thank you,
Okay.
Dr. Kelly. We just moved to Q&A session. So James, can you Can you provide some question?
Yes, thank you very much for doing this very interesting work. We just published, a group of us just published a review on molecular level studies related to mineral water interfaces. And one of our recommendations at the end of that was that we needed to do a better job working with people at the macro scale, working with engineers to try and make our work more relevant. And so I'm wondering if you think that, you know, the kind of work you do could benefit from better molecular understanding of dissolution, precipitation, nucleation, diffusion,
Yes.
wettability, interfacial tensions, and all that. And if so, you know, how can we go about getting these groups to work more in concert? I know the CO2 roundtable, supercritical CO2 roundtable report from DOE is recommending that approach. And so we're trying to reach out to find people like you who might be interested and have some way of incorporating molecular level information into surface complexation modeling and reactive transport.
Yeah, thank you so much, James. Completely, yes. We can't do it all, any of our labs, right? So for us, we created a framework currently, and we're creating, you know, it's a work in progress for how to incorporate some of those, what you just mentioned, more interfacial or MD style interactions. So yeah, that information is yes, what we need from the lower scale. And then, like you said, we can kind of look at also the petrography work and see what happened pre-post simulation. Now, as to how to facilitate the collaboration, yeah, that's why we're giving talks. We could talk more later. Yeah, I've noticed though, one thing that I really enjoyed since just starting recently is that I feel that there's been so much positive energy in the energy transition space, that teams are collaborating more than ever. I don't know, I was in industry for a few years, so maybe I don't know what the status quo is, but I'm hopeful that as long as we can keep our energy up, we continue these discussions. So thank you. I think I have a few of my students on the call. We'll check out your paper, or the review paper you mentioned. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, that would be Banuelos et al., and that's in Chemical Reviews. It was just published this past spring. And I'm going to talk to this group as soon as this meeting is over. So I'll mention your name if maybe we could set up a meeting sometime to chat.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you for attending. Thanks for the question. Okay.
Okay, there is some question in chat. Andres has some question, but Lon responds something. Andres, do you have more question?
No, it's just the same. I just quickly summarize it. Nice talk, Shaina. Thank you. The quick question is, so first of all, I want to make you aware of, maybe you are aware of already, because you know, if you work with Peter Kellerman at Columbia. So here at the Bureau, Esti Ukar, she's my colleague. She's leading a new project now. She's actually at the CarbFix meeting in Iceland now, so that's why she's not here. Where we are sort of we're going to rely on the swelling property of these reactions, the carbonation reactions of ultramafic rocks. We are getting ready to do a field test in Ontario on a nickel cobalt mine, and relying on this swelling property to actually loosen up some ultramafic rocks, then we potentially will be able to easily mine, and at a low cost, some nickel and cobalt ore. So do you consider as the swelling of these rocks in your modeling, and do you know how will affect porosity permeability?
So currently we don't, it'll be a lot to couple the geomechanics part of it, but so we currently are not considering the like the rock fracture. You're saying it breaks along grain boundaries or intergrain boundaries. However, yes, we're working with Peter a lot on that question from the experimental side at present. Like some of those pore-scale little models I was talking about, they were actually made in concert with that same hypothesis you're mentioning. Numerically, it's a very tricky problem, and there's people far more talented at modeling like the geomechanics at the pore scale, poroelasticity. However, yeah, by creating those very controlled bead packs, we've been having a little bit of luck about understanding what you just said, but it is tricky to find like the regime diagram for where the reactive cracking happens and where maybe it doesn't. Yeah, but I thank you so much for making that connection. It's a super exciting like problem.
Thanks.
Okay, one more question from William Wang. So yeah, how did you drive the flow to make a simulation stable?
So you're saying so essentially you're saying how do we in the lattice Boltzmann simulations, or yeah, okay, sorry, you said simulation, sorry. Yeah, so the flow rate that's Tian Zhao's mainly doing those work. So I don't think he's on the call, but essentially he's using standard like LBM paradigms for that, and then he essentially you know, make sure to check that there's not like spurious flows. We pretty much know if a simulation doesn't make sense when we look at it afterwards. I'm not sure, can you give me more specifics? Like, are you talking about like what boundary conditions we use or flow
So,
rates?
William,
Yeah.
can you microphone turn on and then ask her? William, there is no William.
Or feel free to follow up after as well, that's fine.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. I can
So-
connect you to Tian Zhao, who's more like on the ground with this right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So any other question? No? Okay. Yeah, okay. I think that's it. That's
Okay.
all question to you. So yeah, thanks for your time and your talk today. We closed seminar series today. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Have a great day. Happy weekend.
Yeah, bye-bye.